The roar that ripped through the torrential downpour was not a sound of dominance or rage. It was the raw, guttural cry of a father's breaking heart. Koko, the magnificent silverback gorilla, stood drenched on the precipice of a rocky fissure, his immense power rendered utterly useless. Below him, in the churning, muddy water that was rapidly filling the crevice, his infant son struggled. The tiny ape's arms thrashed against the icy current, its wide, terrified eyes locked on the colossal figure of its protector. Koko's mind, usually a calm center of authority and control, was a storm of pure, unadulterated panic. Every muscle in his body was coiled to spring, to save, but the cruel geometry of the trap made him a helpless spectator to his own blood's desperate fight for life. From the infant's perspective, the world had dissolved into a chaotic nightmare of cold and violent motion. The water was a merciless thief, stealing warmth from its small body and breath from its burning lungs. The sky, the rocks, the familiar jungle, all were gone, replaced by a brown, swirling vortex that pulled it down. Above, a dark, familiar shape was the only anchor in its terrifying new reality. It was Father, a mountain of safety. Yet, he was impossibly far away. The infant didn't understand why he didn't just reach down and pluck it from this watery torment. It only knew the numbing exhaustion spreading through its limbs, and the primal fear of being separated, of being lost to the deafening roar of the flood. A few yards away, hidden partially by the thick, dripping foliage, primatologist Eris Thorne was a statue carved from ice. His heart hammered a frantic rhythm against his ribs, a wild drumbeat in the symphony of the storm. He wasn't just watching a biological event. He was witnessing a soul-shattering tragedy. The scientific detachment he had cultivated over years of observation was completely gone, washed away by the deluge and Koko's profound agony. He was caught in an impossible crossfire, the desperate human urge to rush forward and help, and the paralyzing, instinctual terror of the grieving giant. Koko's grief was a tangible force, a volatile energy that could erupt into deadly violence at the slightest perceived threat, and Eris knew he was the most immediate threat in the vicinity. The situation was deteriorating with every passing second. The infant's frantic movements were becoming weaker, its high-pitched cries now just faint, desperate whimpers that were swallowed by the storm's fury. Koko's roars of frustration had subsided into a low, guttural moan of pure despair, a sound that chilled Eris more than any display of aggression. It was the sound of hope dying. Eris felt the world narrow to this single, impossible choice. He could remain a spectator and watch a life extinguish, or he could step into the heart of a titan's sorrow, risking everything. But to understand how they arrived at this impossible precipice, we must go back to the sun-drenched hours before the sky wept and the earth opened up to create this trap. Time is block 2, context. Hours earlier, the ever-missed sanctuary had been a cathedral of sunlight and emerald leaves. Eris Thorne sat motionless behind his observation blind, the powerful lens of his camera, a passive extension of his own patient gaze. His focus was a small, rambunctious ball of black fur named Liko, Koko's youngest. The infant was a whirlwind of clumsy energy, tumbling through soft moss and batting at butterflies with comical ferocity. Eris felt a familiar warmth spread through his chest, a feeling that went far beyond scientific interest. He had watched this tiny life enter the world and had chronicled every milestone. From Liko's perspective, the still shape in the distance was just another part of his playground, a silent, unmoving tree that sometimes glinted in the sun. The world was safe, held securely in the orbit of his father's immense presence. Koko presided over the scene with the quiet majesty of a mountain. His mind was not on dominance or territory, but on the simple, profound joy of his son's existence. He felt the warmth of the sun on his powerful silver back and listened to the familiar sounds of his family foraging nearby. The man, Arius, was a known quantity. For years, the scent of this human had been a benign presence on the wind, never associated with fear or aggression. Koko had learned to interpret the human stillness as a sign of respect, a silent agreement. When Liko stumbled in a mock charge, Koko let out a low, rumbling grunt, a sound of paternal amusement and encouragement. Eris, recognizing the tone instantly, smiled. It was the universal language of a proud father, a sound he knew well. The bond had been forged in small, quiet moments like these. One afternoon, Liko, emboldened by curiosity, had found a bright red hibiscus flower and toddled toward the edge of the clearing, closer to Eris than ever before. He placed the flower on a rock, looking directly at the observation blind, a clear, inquisitive offering. Coco watched, alert but not alarmed. Eris's heart had swelled. He didn't move, didn't break the spell, but he lowered his camera slightly in a gesture of acknowledgement. Liko, sensing the peaceful response, let out a happy squeal and tumbled back to his mother. For the infant, the still man was not a threat, but a curiosity that responded with gentle inaction. For Eris, it was a profound gift, a moment of connection that no scientific paper could ever capture. This was the unspoken pact of the sanctuary, a carefully maintained distance built on a foundation of mutual respect. Eris never crossed the invisible line, and Coco, in his deep primate wisdom, had come to understand that the man's purpose was to watch, not to harm. The primatologist was a witness to their lives, not an intruder. This delicate truce had allowed Eris to see the soul behind the silverback, the tender father beneath the titan's muscle. It was this very trust, cultivated over thousands of patient hours under a peaceful sun, that made the impending chaos so much more tragic. No one could have predicted that the sky itself would soon betray them, turning their sanctuary into a trap. And what happened next would test the limits of that fragile bond. The tranquil memory of the sunlit clearing shattered, throwing Eris back into the violent chaos of the present. The storm's fury had intensified, turning the rain from a downpour into a percussive assault that hammered the earth and trees. The water in the fissure was no longer just rising. It was a churning, hungry beast, its muddy torrent clawing at the rock walls with a deafening roar. Liko, the infant gorilla, was now barely a speck in the vortex. His frantic thrashing had ceased, replaced by a slow, almost dreamlike paddling that did little to fight the current. He was a tiny, flickering candle flame about to be extinguished by the overwhelming power of the flood, his small life hanging by the most fragile of threads against the relentless, impersonal force of nature. From within the icy torrent, Liko's world had shrunk to a blur of cold and pain. The numbing chill had seeped deep into his bones, stealing the last of his strength and replacing it with a heavy leaden exhaustion that pulled him down. He could no longer feel his own limbs. The image of his father, once a towering mountain of safety, was now a distorted, blurry shape seen through a curtain of water and failing consciousness. A profound sense of surrender began to wash over him, a quiet acceptance of the crushing weight and the dark pull. His small lungs burned for air, but the will to fight for it was fading, dissolving into the swirling brown water that was claiming him as its own. Coco's immense chest heaved with ragged breaths, each one a testament to his agonizing impotence. The silverback, a creature whose physical power was legendary, was reduced to a frantic sentry at the edge of his son's watery prison. He slammed his fists into the soaked earth, the thuds absorbed by the mud, a futile gesture against an enemy he could not grapple with. His intelligent eyes, which normally held a deep, contemplative calm, were now wide with a primal terror he had never known. He could see the life draining from his son, could smell the scent of death on the wind, and it was breaking him from the inside out. Every instinct screamed to intervene, but the merciless physics of the situation held him captive. The rest of the gorilla family was a tableau of shared despair. Liko's mother huddled a short distance away, her knuckles white as she gripped a tree root, her low, mournful cries swallowed by the storm. She was held in place by a paralyzing combination of fear for her infant and the terrifying aura of Coco's grief, which was so potent it felt like a physical barrier. The other members of the troop watched from the relative safety of the tree line, their usual social order completely dismantled. Their dark, intelligent eyes reflected the scene of unfolding tragedy, their collective presence serving only to amplify the profound isolation of Coco's suffering and the hopelessness of Liko's plight. They were a family forced to witness its own heart being torn apart. For Aris, the scientific mission had officially died. He was no longer a primatologist observing a natural event. He was a man watching a child drown while its father was forced to watch. The rain streaming down his face mixed with the hot tears he didn't realize he was shedding. The ethical principle of non-interference, a creed he had lived by for decades, now felt like a hollow, cowardly excuse for inaction. He could feel the seconds stretching into an eternity, each one a missed opportunity, a step closer to an irreversible tragedy. The risk of approaching a grieving 400-pound silverback was immense, a potentially fatal decision. But as he watched Liko's head dip beneath the surface, he knew the risk of doing nothing was infinitely greater. The situation reached its absolute breaking point. The rising water finally consumed the last sliver of rock Liko had been clinging to, and his small body was swept into the main current, tumbling end over end. A final, desperate bubble of air escaped his lips. Koko let out a roar that was not of anger, but of pure, soul-shattering loss, a sound that seemed to shake the very foundations of the jungle. It was the sound of a universe collapsing. In that moment, the choice became terrifyingly clear to Eris, solidifying from a theoretical dilemma into an immediate, physical imperative. Time was running out. Something had to be done, or all would be lost. That sound, Koko's cry of absolute loss, was the catalyst that shattered Eris's paralysis into a million pieces. The scientist in his mind screamed about protocols, about the prime directive of non-interference, about the sheer suicidal folly of approaching a distraught silverback. But another voice, older and more powerful, drowned it out. It was the voice of pure, unvarnished empathy. He saw not a specimen in peril, but a child. He felt not an animal's grief, but a father's. With a sudden, decisive movement, he let his expensive camera and pack slide from his shoulders, dropping them into the mud with a wet thud. It was a baptism, a shedding of his old self. He was no longer an observer. In that single, irrevocable moment, he chose to become a participant in this sacred, terrible drama. Eris took a single, deliberate step out from behind the curtain of leaves, entering the small, charged arena of Koko's grief. He kept his hands open and away from his body, a universal sign of peace he hoped would transcend the species barrier. The air grew thick, heavy with an almost electrical tension. Koko's head snapped towards the movement, his eyes, burning with sorrow, instantly locking onto the human figure. The gorilla's mind, a maelstrom of panic and despair, struggled to categorize this new development. This was the still man, the scent on the wind, the non-threat, but now he was moving, closing the sacred distance, violating the unspoken pact that had defined their years of coexistence. A low, warning rumble started deep in Koko's chest, a seismic tremor of confusion and rising protective fury. Ignoring the primal fear that screamed at him to retreat, Eris took another slow step. In response, Koko rose to his full, magnificent height, a 400-pound mountain of muscle and righteous fury silhouetted against the storm. He was a living wall, an embodiment of paternal protection, and his presence alone was enough to stop any predator on Earth. Eris froze, his feet rooted to the muddy ground, but he did not look away. He held the silverback's gaze, letting all of his own fear, his own desperation, and his own profound sorrow for the infant's fate show in his eyes. He wasn't challenging the king. He was pleading with the father. And in that raw, unfiltered honesty, Koko saw something that stopped the rage in its tracks. Not an intruder, but a reflection of his own soul-crushing helplessness. The world seemed to hold its breath. The roar of the flood, the only sound in a universe, shrunk to these two beings. Koko's chest heaved, his immense shoulders slumping ever so slightly. The aggressive posture softened, replaced by a deep, shuddering weariness. He let out a low, guttural grunt, a sound that was not a threat, but a complex note of resignation and desperate hope. Then, in an act that defied every instinct for territorial defense and suspicion, the great ape took one deliberate, heavy step to the side. He didn't retreat. He cleared a path. He was granting permission. This impossible act of faith was not the end of the challenge, but the beginning of a far more dangerous one. Eyes Block 5, Climax/Resolution. With Coco's unspoken permission hanging in the air, Eris moved. Time itself seemed to warp, each second stretching into a thick, syrupy eternity. He scrambled down the slick rock face, his boots finding precarious purchase on the wet, unforgiving stone. The icy water, a churning monster of mud and debris, bit at his ankles and then his knees, its chilling grip a stark reminder of the stakes. He could feel Coco's presence behind him, not as a threat, but as a silent, thunderous witness. The silverback's heavy breathing was a constant, rhythmic counterpoint to the storm's chaos, a sound that was both a promise of protection and a warning of the fragile truce hanging by a single, fraying thread. Every fiber of Eris's being was focused, a conduit for a single, desperate purpose. His fingers finally found their mark, plunging into the frigid water and making contact with soaked, matted fur. The little body was terrifyingly limp, trembling not with fear but with the deep, final shudders of encroaching hypothermia. Liko was barely conscious, his eyes half closed, a tiny soul on the verge of being extinguished. Eris's touch was impossibly gentle, a stark contrast to the violence of the current. He slid one hand under the infant's chest, the other cradling its head, feeling the delicate weight of the life he held. In that moment, a profound connection passed between them, a silent plea from the infant and a silent promise from the man. For a fleeting second, the roaring world fell away, leaving only this fragile point of contact. Lifting the infant was a battle against a relentless enemy. The current fought him with a malevolent, unseen force, trying to wrench Liko from his grasp and pull them both down into the abyss. Eris planted his feet, his muscles screaming in protest as he leaned back, using his entire body as an anchor against the water's powerful suction. The infant was a dead weight, his small form heavy with water and exhaustion. Eris gritted his teeth, the strain radiating through his arms and back as he fought to break the water's hold. He was acutely aware of Coco watching, judging every movement, every sign of weakness. This was more than a physical test. It was a test of will against the raw, impersonal power of nature itself. The ascent was a heart-stopping climb against gravity and fear. Cradling Liko securely against his chest with one arm, Eris used his free hand to claw for purchase on the slippery rock wall. He shielded the infant's body with his own, absorbing the punishing spray of the flood. Each upward movement was a victory, a small miracle of balance and strength. He could feel the infant's faint heartbeat against his ribs, a fragile rhythm he was determined to protect. The world had narrowed to the few feet of rock in front of him, the weight in his arms, and the immense, silent pressure of the silverback's gaze following his every inch. One misstep, one moment of hesitation, and it would all be for nothing. Finally, his hand found the solid ground of the ledge. With a final, desperate surge of adrenaline, he hauled himself and his precious cargo over the edge, collapsing onto the muddy earth. He didn't drop Liko. He carefully, reverently, placed the small, shivering body onto a patch of moss, away from the churning abyss. For a moment, there was only the sound of the storm and Eris's own ragged gasps for air. Then, a small, weak cough racked the infant's body, expelling a gush of muddy water. It was followed by a shuddering, miraculous intake of breath, a sound of life returning that was louder and more profound than any roar. The tiny chest rose and fell and rose again. Coco moved with a speed that defied his massive size. He was not a creature of rage, but one of pure, focused love. He bypassed Eris completely, his entire universe narrowing to his son. With hands that could shatter bone, he scooped up the tiny, shivering form, cradling Liko against his immense chest, with a tenderness that brought tears to Eris's eyes. A low, rumbling purr of pure, unadulterated relief vibrated from the silverback, a sound of a world being put back together. Eris remained frozen, a spectator to the sacred reunion. Then, Coco slowly turned his head, and his deep, intelligent eyes locked with Eris's. What passed between them in that silent, rain-soaked moment was a bond forged in the heart of tragedy, an understanding that would change them both forever. Sword Block 6, Epilogue/Moral. 2 weeks later, the sun once again bathed the ever-missed sanctuary in a warm golden light, as if trying to erase the memory of the storm's violent intrusion. From his familiar observation post, Eris Thorn watched the world through his lens, but everything had changed. He was no longer just a scientist cataloging behavior. He was a guardian watching over a miracle. Liko, a vibrant ball of black fur, tumbled through the emerald moss with renewed energy, his near-death experience seemingly forgotten, replaced by the boundless joy of life. Coco sat nearby, a mountain of quiet contentment, his presence a comforting anchor. The air, once thick with the tension of potential tragedy, was now filled with a profound and palpable peace, a tranquility that felt earned, sacred, and unbreakable. The sanctuary was not just a habitat anymore. It was a place of rebirth. The unspoken pact between man and ape had been irrevocably rewritten. The invisible line that once separated their worlds was no longer a barrier, but a bridge of shared experience. Liko would often pause in his play, his curious eyes finding the glint of Eris's camera, and let out a happy, chuffing sound before bounding back to his mother. It was a clear, unambiguous acknowledgement. But the most significant change was in Coco. The great silverback no longer viewed Eris with tolerant indifference. When their eyes met across the clearing, which they often did, Coco's gaze held a deep, resonant understanding. It was a look of recognition, a silent acknowledgement of the debt and the bond forged in the heart of the flood. He saw not a human, but an ally, a fellow protector. The incident had shattered Eris's scientific detachment, replacing it with a far more profound truth. He realized that the greatest discoveries were not made through a lens, but through a heart willing to break its own rules for the sake of another. The rescue was not a story of a man saving an animal. It was a story of two fathers, bound by the universal language of love for their child, who chose to trust each other against all instinct. Coco's ultimate act of courage wasn't a display of physical power, but the quiet, vulnerable decision to step aside and allow help. It was a powerful lesson that empathy is a current that flows through all living things, and that true strength is measured not in might, but in compassion. That quiet understanding became the new foundation of their world. Coco's low, rumbling grunts now carried a different meaning for Eris, not just the sounds of a gorilla, but the voice of a friend. In the heart of the wild, where survival is often seen as a brutal and solitary affair, an unbreakable bond had been formed, proving that the capacity for love and trust is not confined to a single species. It is a universal force, a light that can shine even in the darkest of storms, reminding us that we are all part of the same miraculous story of life. Do you also believe animals can teach us about love? Share your story and subscribe for more faith-restoring moments.